Hi, welcome to Mindful Living Week. My name is Acharya Fleetmall, and I'm here with Roshi, Joan, Halifax. Welcome, Roshi.
Hi, how are you, Fleet?
It's great to see you.
Oh,
Roshi and I are dear friends. We've worked together a long time, so it's wonderful to see you. Are you there at Upaya?
I am happily here at Upaya. It's just the end of winter, which didn't exactly come, but in any case, the harmony here is so nourishing.
Well, today we're going to explore themes of courage, fear, passion, and referencing Roshi's been a pioneer in the what you might call the conscious living and dying movement and end of life care, contemplative life care, deep ecology work, Buddhism, Zen training, socially engaged Buddhism, so many different areas, and doing work that you use this term edge states in your book, which we're going to explore. You've really been exploring that Dharma at the edge of really challenging areas and places of life within ourselves and culturally and around the world for a long time. The work you've been doing in Nepal for years and with the Nomad Clinic and everything. So at any rate, I'm really looking forward to working with your new book because I see it looks incredibly practical and it's organized around this idea of edge states, talking about various sort of pro-social qualities and characteristics but from the perspective of this idea of edge states and going to the high edge and falling over the edge, and it seems fascinating. So why don't you tell us, what do you mean by an edge state?
Well, edge states are these powerful human virtues that are essential for us to actualize and to rest in our human experience. Without these states, in a way, we're dead to each other. And I learned about these states not only from, as I said, my own experience, Fleet, but also from bearing witness to so many other people who are in their various ways serving others. And the states that I've concentrated on, because I think there are many edge states, but I've concentrated on 5 edge states that I feel are really essential for us to understand in today's very fraught world. They include altruism and the shadow side of altruism, which is pathological altruism, which is when we harm ourselves or we harm others in the act of serving them, or harm the institution that we're serving, or harm the institutions that we're endeavoring to serve, or even the nation that we're endeavoring to serve. Like, for example, Haiti, where pathological altruism disempowered people and also actually caused a lot of people to get sick. Nepal is another example. I also look at empathy in depth and the experience of empathic overarousal and empathic distress. When we fuse too greatly with the experience of another, when we bring them too close in our subjectivity, into our subjectivity, when we become overwhelmed by the experience of others, then we go into empathic distress. And I think many people suffer from empathic distress. I also look at integrity and moral suffering. So integrity is when we're basically aligned with our values. And moral suffering has 4 different aspects that I've identified, which include moral distress, moral injury, moral outrage, and moral apathy. And I try to go into these 4 aspects as deeply as I can, because I think they're experiences that are very familiar to many of us. I also look at respect and disrespect. And disrespect is when we hold ourselves in regard, others in regard, and when we respect our values, principles. And when we are disrespectful, and I concentrate particularly, Fleet, on bullying. When there's horizontal hostility, when we actually tear down our peers. And also I look at vertical violence when there's top-down bullying, like clinicians bullying a patient, or even a patient bullying a clinician. So bullying is, I think, a very big issue in our culture today, and disrespect is something I think is important for us to explore deeply. And the third area I look at is engagement. And this is this quality that we bring to our lives and to our work, where there's a sense of alignment, where the environment in which we're working is wholesome and generative, and where we experience a kind of wholehearted connection. And the shadow side of engagement is burnout, and we know a lot about burnout. It's that experience where we're exhausted, we feel our work makes very little difference, and where the environment that we're working in is quite toxic. Mm. The final section of the book Fleet focuses on compassion. And compassion is a kind of lever. It's a means that we can use to mentally transform the shadow side of these edge states. And I explore the suite of features that comprise compassion. I've developed this heuristic model of compassion that I think is really important because it helps us train others in compassion more skillfully. And then I developed a process, an intervention that we can use while interacting with others who are suffering. And that model, that process is called grace. And we'll talk about it at the final part of this particular class.
Yeah, you know, Roshi, I'm very familiar with looking at the shadow sides of altruism and empathy, especially we have the term empathy fatigue, which was, I think, first talked about among nurses back in the 1950s, when people were seeing how quickly they were burning out in their careers. But I hadn't really thought of it that often in terms like integrity, respect, but as you're talking about it, as I've begun to look at your book, I see it's really fascinating to look at it that way. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the dynamic. I almost got the sense that of getting to the high edge of something, that it's almost like the more you get to optimizing one of these qualities like altruism or empathy, being at the high edge, you're almost in danger of slipping over the edge. And then I think I hear you saying something like, having slipped over the edge, that's where our journey really begins to deepen, and that's where the compassion comes in. So could you talk about that flow or that dynamic a little bit?
One of the aspects, Fleet, about being on the high edge is that you can fall over the edge more easily. Mm-hmm. But another aspect is that you can see the whole landscape. And that, I think, is really important. If we're just sort of in the bubble of integrity, we don't have the opportunity to really access the teachings from the fraught side of integrity. And as a result of that, our capacity to sense into the suffering of others is somewhat compromised. Mm-hmm. So when I talk about the high edge, I'm talking about a big view, a view that is all-encompassing, a view that we can characterize by radical inclusivity, a view also that engenders humility, because, you know, we're always in that dance of balance at that edge, where we know, in fact, we can be giving our best if in a way that is somehow compromised, and we go over the edge. At our way back to the high edge, our attitude could be then characterized by both wisdom with a lot of humility.
So the high edge, from that sense of being a very large perspective, is awareness of the shadow, really owning the shadow.
That's right. It's actually making what is in the shadow visible, and therefore not at the preconscious or unconscious level becoming a toy of the shadow.
I think that's so important, because with a lot of these qualities, it's very easy, I think, to get into a kind of wish thinking. I remember my first teacher had this term, as you know, spiritual materialism. And it's like, well, those must be other people, you know. And it simply meant that the way that the self-structure of the ego co-opts spiritual ideas is more itself. And of course we all do that until we don't. Right? So we all want to be in this wishful thinking. Well, I think I'm genuinely compassionate. I think I'm empathic, but I'm not rescuing people. I think I'm this. I want to be this. And we hesitate to actually embrace the whole journey, these shit, with all that's there.
And somehow, if we're just resting in the virtue, the pure form of the virtue is not even accessible.
Mm-hmm.
I actually also think that Trungpa Rinpoche's vision of spiritual materialism is really important for this notion of the edge states.
Mm-hmm.
That is to say, when ego is involved in altruism, then it's not really altruism.
Mm-hmm.
It's compromised.
Mm-hmm.
Altruism is compromised. When we don't know how to set good boundaries and can't distinguish self from other, but also not objectifying the other, but we over-identify with the other in a way where that's a kind of materialism. That's a kind of acquisition of the identity of the other. And when we're disrespectful in a way, that also is related to spiritual materialism, because it's related to the conceits. It's the notion that we're better than others. And integrity and engagement, the same sort of view.
I like what you said before about the humility that we get by, exploring the shadow side with compassion, because otherwise we really kind of cut ourselves, and there's this idea of, that old idea, never forget the neighborhood you came from. And in the Shambhala teaching, the idea of the cocoon is a place of where, eventually we kind of step out of the cocoon of our stuff. But you never want to forget that, because it's by remembering and owning that engenders compassion and connection with others.
That's great. That's wonderful. Absolutely aligned with what I've written about in the book, Fleet.
Mm-hmm. So, these are not just, I like the way you're talking about it. Maybe we could explore some of them a little more. Not just a binary choice, right? It's really a complete package, so to speak, and a journey. And ideas like the wounded healer come up for me, work, and these kind of ideas that somehow it's having embraced the full journey that we have the humility and the wisdom to actually be effective in the world.
Yeah, in fact, I do cite the archetype of the wounded healer in one small section of the book, but it actually plays out throughout the book in the sense that falling over the edge is what helps to strengthen our character when we make our way back to the high edge of the virtue. And it's an initiatic journey in a kind of way. And so it captures the spirit of what happened, the sort of archetype of the wounded healer who ended up, through his own wound and his own pain, becoming a kind of bodhisattva, healing others. And it's the sense of how suffering can be transformed into compassion and wisdom.
Especially in exploring integrity and respect. I can't help but think of kind of this tidal wave of cultural change we're in right now, very long needed cultural change around this Me Too movement and so forth, and everything that's going on. And, I think there's, obviously it's a very necessary thing. And with any big change like this, it's messy. So there's a lot going on. And obviously, probably has shadow elements of it as well. But I'm wondering if you could talk about that. You mentioned bullying, and you mentioned, in disrespect. And I wonder if you could talk about that in terms of our culture and where this movement is headed.
Well, the fraud valence, the shadow valence of integrity is moral suffering. And I think that there are many ways that we're experiencing moral suffering in our time. I've identified 4. I'm sure there are more. But might be useful for me to go into those 4, because I think they're important for us to know about as we face what's happening, not only in our country, but really globally, in terms of the transgression of our values and virtues. So I write about the experience of moral fleet And it's when we see harm being done to another, whether the other is an animal, another human being, a community, the earth, the world. And we see a way through, but we're not able to actualize it. And so we experience moral distress. In other words, there's a moral dilemma that we've identified. Often we experience a kind of empathic resonance in the context of that moral distress. And then what happens is we don't know how to right things. And so we suffer as a result of it. I also write about moral injury, which has been identified extensively within the military. But I've also medicine, education, human rights organizations, parents. I spoke with a parent yesterday who actually felt, after many years, a kind of self-shame in having spanked his son when his son was 3 years old. And though he caused some level of trauma to his son, he also felt that he had done something harmful to his son. And that's the kind of thing that we call moral injury.
So moral injury,
it's when
it's the idea of this idea of moral stress or role conflict, and these kind of things are actually reaching the level of being traumatizing.
Absolutely. Moral injury, moral distress is when we might not have engaged in the harmful act, we've witnessed it.
Mm-hmm.
For example, our current political situation, maybe we have not contributed directly to the kind of suffering we're seeing in relation to our current regime. Mm-hmm. But what we experience is moral distress because we don't seem to have the power or the skillful means to actually transform the conditions that are giving rise to this big moral conflict or moral dilemma that we are aware of. Moral injury has to do with shame and self-blame. We either have witnessed or we have been a part of harming others. And as a result of that, we feel traumatized and self-blaming, and we feel ashamed of ourselves. It's very common in the military. I'm sure you saw it in the prison industrial system. I've heard about it, and I'm sure also witnessed it in the medical system. Educators have shared this with me. They feel, educators of me that, like No Child Left Behind, ashamed in having implemented a program which actually harmed children. And so they experience moral injury. The third area that I've identified of moral suffering fleet is called moral outrage. And moral outrage is composed of a combination of disgust and anger. And it's when the transgression of a good world, transgressive acts, trespassing acts, and we experience anger, and we express that anger in the world in terms of shaming others and blaming others. And I say that, moral outrage can really be important because, like in Me Too, many women experienced moral injury for years. They experienced moral distress. In other words, they couldn't hold the perpetrators. They were discounted. They experienced moral because they know not only have they been harmed, but other women have been harmed. They feel ashamed because they've been taken advantage of, or we've been taken advantage of. And they experience moral injury in that way. But now the exercise is different. In the Me Too movement, it's an exercise of profound disclosure and holding the perpetrators of sexual violence and sexual harassment accountable. And as I said, it brings together anger and disgust. And there are two aspects of moral outrage that I think are really interesting. One is episodic. In other words, it arises in relation to a particular incident. The other is chronic, that is, people whose frame of reference is always characterized by judge blame. And, that kind of process of chronic moral outrage is very disabling for the individual who is in the grip of it, but also it's socially disabling. And so I make quite a case against chronic moral outrage book. Fleet, the fourth kind of moral suffering that I've identified is called moral apathy. And Fleet, I actually had thought about this category till I went to see the film about James Baldwin called I'm Not Your Negro. And he nailed it. And I use his example and his words to open up the section on moral apathy. When we're experiencing moral apathy, we're aware of it. Sometimes we're not aware of it. We might be in a social bubble or a religious bubble or a belief bubble that basically protects us from understanding the suffering, even seeing the suffering of others. Sometimes we see the suffering and we make ourselves self-apathetic through our addictions. So moral apathy is a very serious expression of moral suffering because we see it in relation to how women have been treated. We see it in relation to racist and ethnic violence. We see it in relation to what I experienced in my early years of working in the end-of-life care field, of seeing how dying people were even marginalized. We see it walking on the streets of New York and San Francisco or Santa Fe when people encounter a homeless person and just walk by them as though they're an inert object. Moral apathy is a pretty serious expression of moral suffering.
Martin Luther King referenced that. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was something to the effect that there was the moral apathy of otherwise working white middle-class folks was a great goal to the liberation and civil rights of people of color than the so-called, Ku Klux Klan or the antipathy of those people that would call racist. He said the bigger problem is the moral apathy of the otherwise well-meaning or good people.
King totally nailed it there. And I think actually James Baldwin played off of King's insight in this regard when he described moral apathy. It's certainly, it shows me, in other words, the bubble that I live in, that I hadn't identified moral apathy really until I saw the film and heard Baldwin use that term, and I went, yes, we're caught in the grip of moral apathy.
What do you say to people who, not to people, but to us, to me, with sometimes I think our sense of moral distrust is so pervasive. We all have our experience with moral injury. Sometimes we just don't want to live. We certainly don't want to, at least those of us who haven't gotten caught in it, we don't want to live in that place of moral outrage chronically, as you described, and it's not a healthy place to live. But we just feel so overwhelmed by the all-pervasive-ness that the tendency is to go to apathy,
just to check out.
Intentionally or not.
No, yeah, absolutely.
Intentionally or not.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the ways we get called out of apathy is through the moral outrage of the people who have been victimized, who are suffering. Mm-hmm. Another is that when someone who's a peer, steps out of the bubble and turns around and calls us out of our bubble, out of our apathy. Another is that we become so critically apathetic, like through the medium of addiction, that we really hit the bottom. And we realize that we've been covering our own suffering, but the suffering of others.
This is a very timely book indeed. It's so easy to feel lost in just how to relate with, respond to some of these really difficult social issues and and within what's going on, even when we haven't appreciated, well, this is really good and this is really necessary, but I would, I'm very reluctant to even open my mouth because it's all so
I
confusing,
know.
you know. And I think they're giving us some really practical tools on how to
Yeah.
approach it.
Yeah, I
Hmm.
mean, I feel personally that I have learned more. I've lost more, but I've learned more from falling over the edge than being a perfectly equanimous, even-keeled person.
I wouldn't know anything about that.
Well, you seem pretty even-keeled to me, but probably you're referring to me.
No, no, I'm referring to my past. But so maybe it would be good to begin to talk more about compassion, which is, and it's wonderful in the book that you provide practices for working with each one of these, and how I've always appreciated that you have, especially in your work with clinicians, have made that distinction between empathy, which is our capacity to feel, which in an unregulated way leads to burnout, and compassion, which in of itself is transformative. And so, and then you've developed this model, sort of identifying the constituents of it. You can't actually say, well, I'm going to be compassionate, I'm going to try, but you identify constituents which we can cultivate directly, practice, and therefore they lead to becoming more compassionate. As I've heard you describe it, has both the element of being willing to be with our suffering and the suffering of others, as well as the aspiration to do something to alleviate that where we can. And of course, we're not always able to do so.
Yeah, I was so fortunate, Fleet, in being invited to be a distinguished visiting scholar at the Library of Congress, and to have this bubble to uh, protect me from the sort of calls of the world as I began to identify the components of compassion, the suite of features that comprise compassion, because I realized that compassion is rather challenging for others to resource, to relate to drop into, because of the kind of conditioning that we're subject to in our society. And identified a suite of components that are non-compassion, that make it possible for compassion to emerge. And I ask myself, Fleet, for example, can there be compassion without there being grounded attention, being attentional balance? And clearly, attention is essential, because otherwise we're not able to perceive the suffering of another or reality in a clear, unfragmented way. And I ask myself, can there be compassion without basic prosociality, which prosocial means it's the opposite of antisocial. It's qualities that are about connection, relationality, affiliative aspects of our own subjectivity. And I concluded, no, compassion is not possible without caring for others, without feeling concern for others, without tenderness, without love, without appreciation, without gratefulness, and also without healthy empathy. And also, compassion is not possible without having an intention which is basically unselfish. You can't be compassionate and be selfish. It's just like an oxymoron. They're two different polarized aspects. And then I asked myself, how about embodiment and engagement? Are these features important for compassion? And they are. So I developed this heuristic map of compassion. We include attention and affect, intention and insight, and engagement, including embodiment and engagement in the mentally ethical. And after I checked out this model that I developed with a number of social psychologists and neuroscientists, and really worked on refining the model, what I wanted to do was to create a tool And originally I created it specifically for clinicians because that's the population I work with most frequently. But, I also work with various other people, including people in the corporate world and many educators. And I realized this tool was really important for them as well. And the tool is called Grace. And it's a very simple mnemonic. It's very practical. And if you're a Buddhist, you totally get it. It's totally Buddhist. But needless to say, when I'm sitting at MD Anderson or Stanford, I'm not necessarily identifying it within the context of Buddhism. But grace includes the G of grace is gathering our attention. The R of grace is recalling our intention. The A of grace is attuning to ourself, attuning to the body, attuning to the heart, attuning to the mind. Somatic, affective, cognitive self-attunement. And then attuning to the other, which is empathy. Very counterintuitive. Usually we're so diagnostically oriented, fleet, that we generally jump out and we are making judgments and so forth about, who's standing in front of us. But we're actually in this model asked to attune to our own subjectivity first, and then to increase the domain of our subjectivity to include the experience of another. And so that is a very important aspect because that's basically empathy. And then the C of grace is considering what will really serve. And this, the insight using our groundedness as a kind of foundation, our intention, which begins to prime our selflessness, our unselfishness, our kindness, our concern and care, our attunement and empathy, our attunement with others, including the attunement into the context in which the encounter is happening, considering what will really serve, the C of grace. And then E is engaging, which has two aspects. One is the direct or action, or at least the aspiration to engage or for a good outcome. And the second is ending. And so that E of grace points to also how important it is for us to end in the interaction or an aspiration, to come into conclusion, to come into completion. We might need to ask forgiveness. We might want to acknowledge what has happened. We might want to express appreciation. We might also want to define some parameters for the next encounter that we're going to have with this individual. So ending is really important, that we self-acknowledge or interpersonally acknowledge. And we're taking responsibility in a certain way for the interaction and then allowing it to complete. And then we're moving on to our next encounter. So grace, get our attention, recalling our intention, attuning to self, attuning to other, considering what will really serve, engaging and ending. GRAC.
The tremendous value in this, people might think, well, what's the big deal? Compassion's being caring and being kind. But until we investigate it deeply in the way that you have, and you have been for so many years in your work, I think we just easily fall into some kind of wishful thinking kind of question. Or if we're kind of serious about, really wanting to be compassionate, then we're really vulnerable to falling into these shadow elements of burnout, or what's previously called idiot compassion, or rescuing, or pathological altruism, and heading into burnout, or even in the midst of some form of burnout or not really owning our shadow, actually being harmful, causing harm, even with good intentions, or just then ending up in a kind of chronic state where we're actually bullying and really, negative, just because we're acting out our own shadow because we've done ourselves so much harm. And so without investigating, because otherwise, a great deal of society just says, well, compassion's nice, but we'll leave it over there for those people. And really, in terms of the way the world works, it's kind of soft thinking. It's not reality based, right? And then for the world that wants to embrace it, it's all tied up in wishful thinking and values. In my sense, in a way we see it in this context, that compassion is not so much, I mean, it is a value, but it's also the experience of non-separateness, so that our caring arises naturally because we don't feel that separate to begin with. Of course, the danger there is issues of boundaries and all the trouble we can get into. So without investigating this deeply and developing resilience through the practices that you're pointing us towards, it's very difficult terrain to enter into genuinely, which is probably why part of the world avoids it.
Well, and what's fascinating, Fleet, is that in working with neuroscientists and social scientists, what I've learned from them is that there's no downside to compassion. Mm-hmm. And that in fact it decreases stress, it enhances longevity, it enhances moral elevation, and that what is compromised in terms of stress is more related to what's called empathic distress. Mm-hmm. That compassion in its developed form is a complete plus, if you will. And it's also contagious. Mm-hmm. You know, if we see our employer being compassionate, we will tend to be compassionate. If we see the teacher being compassionate, we will tend toward compassion. If we see our parent compassionate, we will tend toward compassion. Our children will tend toward compassion.
Yeah, I was glad you brought that up. I was about to ask a question because I know you've been very involved in the sort of contemplative neuro movement. And, you know, it's pretty clear that our brain and our neurobiology is, on the one hand, really set up and pretty wired for fear-based responses to life. And at the same time, it does seem that we're actually at the same time wired for compassion. And, but, you know, what can bring it? There's some really fascinating things. I've been studying a lot of this and seeing just even one neurotransmitter like the stress hormone oxytocin and how that's involved in everything from a stress response to compassion to courage, joy, and all these different things. And so it's quite fascinating. And I'm curious about still, you know, what's your sense of what call humanity collectively, what's going to call us to the resilience and compassion to actually really begin to deal with the challenges that we face? Because as we all know, from climate change to what's going on, you know, on the global scale with the harm and the war and the genocide and the refugee crises that are still happening, as well as the cultural turmoil and the still existence of racism and poverty here in a very wealthy, prosperous country. To get called out of our sort of reptilian brain into our compassionate.
Well, I don't think people are going to like this possibility, but I think suffering will us out of it.
Yeah. Unfortunately, it does seem to be the answer. Well, this has been really rich, and I'm sure that your book's going to have a very wide readership because it's just so practical and gives us the tools to figure our way through this often confusing human journey, and to really give us the courage to, we don't have to just kind of pretend to be good people, right, and try to create some bubble where I'm a good person. Nobody can challenge the fact that I'm a good person, but we can actually just be human beings, embrace the whole journey, and not get lost in it with this wonderful guidance and these skillful practices.
Thank you, Fleet.
And I really like the fact that the first part of grace, you mentioned balance and gathering attention. I assume you're promoting some kind of contemplative or mindfulness or maintaining this as a ground for
indeed. Well, as you know from having read the book, every section has at the end contemplative practices that can actually nourish, enhance our capacity to stand on the high edge of our humanity.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Roshi.
Love you so much.